Tell us the story of the Baker pharmacy and the Baker family in Monrovia.
Okay. So the first part of the family were actually not Bakers. They were the LaForces, my grandfather's grandparents, maternal grandparents. They retired from Iowa in 1889, and they were distantly connected to the Monroe family. So they already knew about the existence of Monrovia and Southern California. They left Agency, which is an agency named after Agency City because it was once an Indian agency in southeastern Iowa on the Des Moines River, came to Monrovia. And their daughter, Mary Frances LaForce, married William H. Baker, my great-grandfather, and they would periodically come out to visit. There is a great picture that I have in my collection, but I also had a copy made for Doug and Karen Poindexter, who live at 240 West Hillcrest. The house, however, was originally on the corner of Hillcrest and Magnolia, near where the Monroes camped when they first came. In fact, my grandmother pointed out that corner to me as a youngster as being where the Monroes camped.
And who was it built for originally?
It was built for Debbie M. Monroe's bookkeeper, George Dumbbell, and I always include his gravesite at Live Oak when we do the walking tour. And my standard question is, who would want a bookkeeper named Dumbbell? Anyway, George Dumbbell died quite young. He may have come out to California for his health. Anyway, when the LaForces came in 1889, I think they first rented the house and then they finally purchased it. Anyway, there's this great picture, probably taken, I'm guessing about 1894, 1895, of the Bakers on the LaForces, positioned around on the wraparound porch. So they, as I say, they lived here almost all the rest of their lives. Grandmother LaForce died in Monrovia in 1913, and Grandfather LaForce went back to Iowa to live with a married daughter and died the following year in 1914. In the meantime, my grandfather, James Robert Baker, I don't know what prompted him, but he ended up being a pharmacist in Des Moines, Iowa. 1905, my great-grandmother decided that they were going to move to California. And I've got the letter that she wrote to my grandfather in Des Moines saying, "Robert, I wish you would come along because it would make my task much easier if you could come with us for the move to California," which he did. Grandfather Baker stayed back. They had at that point a hardware store in Eldon, Iowa, which is the home of the American Gothic cottage. The Grant Wood painting of the two, you familiar with it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the house in the background is in Eldon, Iowa, and I've looked it up. Anyway, they arrived in Monrovia. They stayed probably with the LaForces for a while until they had accommodations of their own. And my grandfather started looking for work. Well, he went to work for the Sun Drug Company in downtown Los Angeles. It was on South Broadway. I think it might have been a single location operation. I'm not absolutely sure. But he went to work for them and commuted from Monrovia on the Pacific Electric Red Car, which would have been on South Main Street, just a couple blocks away. So he probably took the red car in, got off at the depot, and walked over to the store. Years later, lots of years later, I was taking the bus to work. The bus went on South Broadway. I happened to look up at one of the buildings, and here on this facade was Sun Drug Company. Now the building it changed years before, but the name on the building was still there. My grandmother's story was that the owners of the business were so impressed with his work ethic, that they offered him a partnership, which he declined because his ultimate goal was to practice pharmacy in Monrovia, not in downtown LA. So guess what Sun Drug Company became? Al Rexall. So there went the family fortune. So I've also got the letter that my grandfather wrote to his father back in Iowa Apparently Grandfather Baker was, as soon as he sold the hardware store, he was gonna hightail it from Monrovia and get back in business again. And the letter that my grandfather wrote tells him about the potential prospects in Monrovia to purchase. And he evaluated them, and he was not too flattering. Apparently one of them had a lot of stock that was outdated on the shelves. Basically he was saying, you know, we don't want to touch this one at all. But in the interim, Ben Cruz, who'd been an early day pharmacist in Monrovia, did not have a pharmacy at the time, decided to get back in the pharmacy business once again. So in July of 1909, he opened a brand new drugstore at 608 South Myrtle Avenue, where the Copper Still Grill is now on Myrtle Avenue. And apparently, Grandfather Baker and my grandfather made him an offer that he couldn't refuse because he sold it to them in November of 1909, and it then became Baker's Pharmacy. It operated at that location until 1923, when Grandfather Baker had built a brand new building at Palm and Myrtle, 302 South Myrtle Avenue. And they opened the second store, but kept the first location open. My dad's Uncle Harry laughingly said, all we did was to split the same business between two stores. So within a couple years thereafter, the first location was sold, and Baker's Pharmacy remained at the second location at Palm and Myrtle until it closed in 1977. By that time, it had passed out of family ownership, although the name still remained. My grandfather was in business in partnership until 1923, when he died from TB. By that time, he had two brothers who were pharmacists, and I think they picked up the pharmacy end of things. Grandfather Baker was a merchant, a businessman. He was not a trained pharmacist. So he took care of the business end of things and let his sons take care of the pharmacy end of things.
That great old picture that it has a trolley or something in front of it.
Yeah.
When was that taken, and which store was it in front of?
It was store number 1. It's probably about 1910 or 11. A lot of stock boys and delivery boys worked there over the years, Myron Hotchkiss being one of them.
Really?
And when I first started spending time with Myron, he took the time to draw a scale drawing of the interior of that drugstore, which I have. And he said, now that's where they had the fancy hard soaps for sale. That's where the cigars were sold. That was where the prescription desk was. This is where the soda fountain was. This is where your grandfather filled prescriptions. So he gave it to me, and I've got it tucked away safely somewhere.
So there was a soda fountain.
There was a soda fountain. They probably had sodas, ice cream, etc. So they had magazines, cigars, what they used to call, I think, notions, which would have been like sundries.
Like needles and threads kind of stuff?
Not so much that, but like personal items.
Like toothpaste and
toothpaste, tooth powder, brushes, combs, etc. I think they probably had stationery as well.
Did you ever work there?
I worked in the second location.
What'd you do?
I delivered prescriptions, I waited on customers, I stocked the shelves, I unpacked the deliveries. I labeled the drawers, because if you didn't know from memory where things were, nothing was labeled. You just knew where it was, so you walked over and opened the drawer with no label. So I took it upon myself to create labels for those drawers. And I got to the drawer that had certain items in it, and I thought, gee, when am I going to label this? So I finally came up with prophylactics. And so it remained. So, as I say, Grandpa Baker had 2 sons, actually 3 sons, who were pharmacists. The 4th son, Uncle George, went to work for the post office in Monrovia and was the postmaster at the time of his death from TB in 1929. But Uncle Ben worked in the family drugstore, Uncle Harry, and my grandfather. the two of them, after my grandfather had to stop working because of his own tuberculosis. They hired a lady pharmacist, probably in the early 1930s. Her maiden name was Margaret McDowell, and she, I think, was a USC graduate from the pharmacy school. Well, Uncle Ben and Margaret McDowell perhaps became a little more friendly than they should have. My dad's cousin, Pat, told a story about going to the barber to have her bangs trimmed or something. She was probably 7 or 8 at the time. And the barber started asking her questions, and she said years later, she suddenly realized he was pumping her for information, primarily about gossip about her father and the lady pharmacist. Well, ultimately, Uncle Ben divorced his first wife, married Margaret, and they couldn't stay in Monrovia, so they went to Independence and Lone Pine to get the hell out of Dodge. So that left Uncle Harry. His son Gene, my dad's cousin, also went to pharmacy school. And for many years, the two of them ran the Baker's Pharmacy. Then Uncle Harry died in 1964, and then Gene, his son, took on a partner. Never forget his name. Norval Shehorn. Norval was a great guy, had a great sense of humor. So after my dad's cousin decided to leave Monrovia, not because he got involved with the lady pharmacist, but he wanted to get up to the Sierras. He was a great outdoorsman. He used to spend time at Gem Lake. And so he wanted to be in the Sierras, so they went to, I think, Auburn. Anyway, that left Norval on his own. In about 1977, what Norval said to me, my grandmother's sister inherited the store building itself, not the business, but the building, when Grandpa Baker died. And then after her death, her son inherited the property. And as Norval said, well, I can't get your cousin to do anything about repairing the building. I decided it's time to retire. So he closed Baker's Pharmacy that operated from 1909 to 1977. And I have the old Oliver No. 9 typewriter that my grandfather probably used to type prescription labels on. Actually, my dad had it first, and then I ended up with it later.
Is that the typewriter that's in the Anderson house?
No, the one in this one is even older than the Anderson house. This has keys that go this way instead of this way. But an Oliver No. 9 was a very famous typewriter that had a long, long run. But that was my dad's souvenir. There was the wrapping counter. It was a large oak counter with drawers where you would store things. But the interesting thing about it, the back of the drawer, it had no back to it. The drawers themselves, each individual drawer had a glass fronted, like a shadow box on the end of the drawer. And you would drop advertising down in those glass fronted areas if you had a special or anything like that. It also had a large roll of wrapping paper that you would wrap prescriptions and purchases in. And that was why it was called the wrapping counter. The story I got about that was Grandpa Baker was not one to suffer fools,
Lightly.
Apparently a female customer who'd been grocery shopping came in with her arms full of groceries and plopped them down on the wrapping counter where Grandpa Baker was entering probably charge slips in the ledger. And he took a look at her, he took a look at the ledger, he raised and he swept the groceries off the countertop onto the floor. That was Grandpa Baker. But the motto of the drugstore was, why go elsewhere to be insulted? So anyway, 1977, Baker's Pharmacy closed down, and not too many years after that, the building sold.